This 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. Joining us next for that conversation is John Logsdon. He is the founder of George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. He's the author of the book, John F. Kennedy, The Race to the Moon. We'll have a conversation with him up next. But you remember going back to September of 1962. It was then when President Kennedy gave what would be known as his moon speech at Rice University in Houston, Texas.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. If I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
"50 years ago today, we're celebrating the landing of Apollo 11 on the moon. Remember that took the launch of that a couple of days before that, talking about the historical, cultural, and scientific significance during our program today. And joining us for that conversation, John Logsdon. He is the founder of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, the author of the book John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon. Good morning. Good morning. What was the drive of President Kennedy, do you think?
Competition. The Soviet Union had defined its space success as an indication of the superiority of the communist way of life. It's hard to recreate in 2019 the kind of zero-sum Cold War competition of the late 50s, early 60s, but it was very real to Kennedy. And the idea that space was a measure of national vitality and that the U.S. was behind was not acceptable to him. So he, after the launch of Yuri Gagarin in April of '61, he asked his advisors, and I'm quoting from a memo, find a space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win. And the answer came back, let's go to the moon.
Well, that was from the scientists, I believe, from NASA, basically telling him that. When Kennedy made the pitch to Congress, how was it received?
There was the first pitch, May the 25th, '61, when he went before a joint session of Congress and said, I believe we should go to the moon before this decade is out. The reaction was very positive. Kennedy proposed a very significant budget increase, and it was passed with very few opposing votes in the summer of '61, and NASA was on its way.
And so what was the role then of Lyndon Baines Johnson during this process?
Well, Lyndon was Vice President Johnson had been involved in setting up NASA back in 1958 and was clearly a cheerleader for a very ambitious space program. But when Kennedy decided it was important for national purposes, he basically took the issue back from Vice President Johnson and made it a presidential issue. So Johnson was there, he was involved, but kind of on the margins.
When it comes to public sentiment at the time for Kennedy's proposal, how would you gauge that?
Well, there was a Gallup poll in May of '61 after Gagarin, before Kennedy's speech, asking, are you willing to spend X billion dollars to go to the moon? And 60% of the American public said no. So this was a leadership initiative. This didn't come out of a groundswell of public demand for a major space initiative.
John Logsdon, our guest for this segment. And again, if you want to ask him questions, you can do so. If you watch the moon landing and you want to ask him questions related to that, 202-748-8000. If you are aligned for others, 202-748-8001. You provided us a picture of the day of the launch.
It's true.
You are highlighted in that picture. Talk about that. What were you doing that day? What were your impressions of that day?
Well, I had chosen in 1967 as a graduate student at New York University, and actually already as a faculty member at Catholic University here in Washington, to write my PhD dissertation on Kennedy's decision to go to the moon. So by 1969, I was pretty well done, and the book was on its way to being published as a book called The Decision to Go to the Moon. And that earned me, I'd been working with NASA in the research, and that earned me a press pass and an invitation to the launch. So I was at the press site at Kennedy Space Center, about as close as a civilian could be to the launch on that morning at 9:32 a.m. So I don't know whether you're showing the picture, but that's me in the red circle, and you know, an unforgettable experience. The sheer power of the Saturn V launch, the low frequency noise which you could physically feel in your body, and the slow acceleration. The thing just seemed to hover before it gathered speed and headed off. And you knew you were seeing something that would go down in the eons of human history. So that combination is totally unforgettable.
What was your level of confidence at the time when you saw the launch that the mission could actually be accomplished?
Probably higher than the crew, because they knew a lot more than I did. Armstrong was quoted as saying he thought that there would be a 90% success they'd get to the moon and back, 50% that the landing would be successful. I guess by that time had pretty high confidence. NASA had pulled off the very bold step of sending people around the moon on Apollo 8 in December of '68, Christmas Eve '68. And so I frankly, you know, stood there thinking this is going to happen.
So our first call for you comes from Augusta, Georgia. This is Mark. You're on with our guest, John Logsdon, the founder of the Space Policy Institute, the author of John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon. Go ahead.
Yes. I first of all want to say thank you to all the people at NASA that made it actually possible. I was a nine-year-old kid watching, well, when they were in orbit of the moon, I think we were over at my grandpa's house, and by the time we got home to Paoli, Indiana, which is where we lived at the time, we watched them actually land. This was, now my mom, she was basically in charge of our little family because my father was off fighting a little war called Vietnam. And I don't know what they did in Vietnam as far as listening to the broadcast from NASA and everything, but I remember playing with a little cardboard toy that you got from the Gulf station that was a thing you hung from a string or something or other and pretended it was this was a cardboard model of the lunar module that you pretended to be landing with, and so we were huddled around the TV set at that time.
Gotcha. John Logsdon, the public sentiment of the time of the launch versus the public sentiment leading up to the launch.
Well, I think by the time of the launch, and particularly after the success of Apollo 8 a few months earlier, there was a building excitement. I mean, and not only in the United States, but the world was watching. The third of the 3 communication satellites necessary for global communication had just been put in orbit a few weeks earlier. So this was the first event that was watched internationally, and something like 600 million people were watching or listening as Armstrong and then Aldrin descended to the lunar surface. So this was a global event celebrated around the world, not only in the United States.
How did Russia react to it?
Well, it's interesting. I have always thought that Russia did not broadcast that in real time. I was listening to a call-in show like this with a woman that said she was in the Soviet Union and that they were watching it live. So that's contrary to my impression, but she was there and I wasn't. So it certainly was not big news in the Russian papers.
Let's hear from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Lene, hello.
Oh, hello. My name is Lene. And thank you so much for taking my call.
You're on. Go ahead.
It's my birthday. I was 15. I was turning 15 the day they landed on the moon. And today I'm 65, celebrating the 50th anniversary and my birthday all at the same time.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. It's an exciting day. I remember watching the moon landing with my family, gathered around our TV set, which was, of course, black and white, listening to Walter Cronkite. And my memory that day is the excitement of them landing on the moon, not only for the first step for mankind and all that happened with that, but also because I don't know how many people realize that the moon is the ruling planet of Cancer, the month of July. The only, when you look at the zodiac, the only planet that's the ruling planet is the moon for the month of July. And I don't know if NASA knew that, why they landed just before Leo, which is ruled by the sun, a couple days from now.
Okay.
So,
Caller, thank you and happy birthday to you. Mr. Logsdon, anything from that?
Well, people talk, as several of your callers already have talked about, watching the moon landing. They didn't do that. There was no camera that caught the landing 4:17 in the afternoon of that Sunday. There was a camera that caught Armstrong's first step, but the landing was all simulation on the various networks. They puzzled how to show this. And if they had been able to show the reality, they would have shown something really remarkable, because as has been said a lot in the past few days, when right before the landing, the lunar module pitched over and Armstrong and Aldrin first saw where they were headed, it was a rocky field full of boulders, not suitable for landing. So Neil had to take over and literally fly the lunar module parallel to the lunar surface for a few seconds, but I'm sure it seemed longer than that, to find a level spot to land. They landed with 17 seconds of fuel left. It was a remarkable piloting achievement.
The scientific efforts at the time, talk a bit about them. What was involved, particularly with the module itself, getting it developed and getting it ready to go? Well,
I suspect your viewers can see the lunar module over my shoulder here. It's a very weird looking spacecraft because it was designed, NASA chose a way of getting to the moon which had a mothership go to lunar orbit, and that mothership was designed to get to lunar orbit, but most importantly to get the crew back to Earth. So it had the fuel and the heavy heat shield for re-entry. And then there was this separate lunar module that was only for going from lunar orbit to the surface. Didn't have to deal with an atmosphere, so didn't have to deal with atmospheric pressures, and so the skin of this was basically paper thin and flexed a lot. So it's not a strong spacecraft, but it was optimized for that one purpose and did it very well.
Was this the final design, or how many versions of
This
designs?
is real.
This is real, but how many versions went through or designs went through before you came up with a final design?
Oh, I think there were, from the time that this approach called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was chosen in 1962 to the final versions that were built, they're probably X, with X being a pretty big number, designs. One of the concerns was weight, so there were great incentives to Grumman, who built the module, to shave every pound of possible weight off of the spacecraft. When NASA was ready after the Apollo 1 fire to resume flights, the lunar module was still not ready. And one of the reasons we sent Apollo 8 around the moon was that was a way of testing the whole system except for the lunar module, which if we had waited for the lunar module, it would have potentially delayed meeting Kennedy's end of the decade deadline.
Here from Sayville, New York is Thomas for our guest John Logsdon. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I have two short stories. The first was I was in Vietnam in 1969, and we didn't know for a couple days. Somebody passed me in the mess hall or someplace and said, "Oh, by the way, we landed on the moon." And I said, "Oh yeah, when?" "Oh, a couple days ago," like it was nothing. And that was what was going on when I served in the Army. And the second story was in my old neighborhood. There was a gentleman, Mr. Jirac, who never served. He was the only father on the block that never served in World War II. But 10 or 15 years ago, when I read the obituary when he passed away, I found out why. Because in World War II, he designed bombs for the Air Force. And when it came to the lunar landing, he also designed two. It was in his obituary. He designed two of the electric motors on the LEM. And I'm calling because I'm so proud that I live so close to a gentleman that had to do with the space program. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, caller.
Yeah, one thing to say is that this was a truly national effort to get those two people on the moon and the 10 people that followed them. There were only 12 people that walked on the moon, only 4 of them still alive. It was 400,000 people spread all over the country that worked more or less directly on Apollo. It was a very peaceful but a warlike mobilization of human and financial resources, which is unlikely to happen again.
How did Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins how were they to become the ones to do this mission?
Well, as they all say over and over again, mainly luck. There was a rotation of crew. So if you were the backup crew on a particular mission, 3 missions later you would be the prime crew. So Armstrong and Aldrin were back up to Apollo 8. Collins had neck surgery but was restored to flight status. And so when it came to 11, they were, by normal rotation, the prime crew. And you have to remember that it was not at all given that Apollo 11 would be first. It was going to be the first attempt, but there were lots of things that could happen to make it not successful. So, and then I think the NASA management recognized that the piloting skill and the personality of Neil Armstrong made him an ideal person to be first.
What is it about that personality that strikes most?
Steady, calm, solid, exuding competence, not calling attention to himself, a true leader of a team, the kind of personality that Neil demonstrated after the mission, and I'll get a cheap shot in here, and was not portrayed in the First Man movie. I think that was not an accurate portrayal of the Neil Armstrong I knew.
From Orlando, Florida, Richard, hello, go ahead.
Good morning. Good morning, America. I had the pleasure of visiting the Kennedy Space Center twice. Once when I was 4, and of course, back then you were allowed into the vehicle assembly building. And when I first went, I saw the Gemini spacecraft inside the building, and I thought, wow, you know, a little kid like me, that was huge. But then when I went back, the spacecraft that was in the building then was Apollo 13. And then I went, oh my gosh, this thing is a monster. And by that time, you know, I was a young teenager. I was lucky enough to, you know, have a Zenith, you know, a big Zenith television that was black and white, but that was okay with us. And that when Apollo took off, it just seemed like it took forever, like for that spacecraft to clear the gantry. Once it cleared the gantry, all of a sudden it's just like boom, and then as you look at the footage, about halfway up, you kind of see where the sonic boom like kind of rolled off the top of the spacecraft, and then seeing it land. I remember my father is a science teacher, so you know, he was very encouraging. You know, took me to NASA every chance he could, and he when they were going to land, and I was watching them, and I was hearing 60 seconds. My dad came flying in the house because he was a real estate broker. And I said, Dad, what's 60 seconds mean? And he goes, they've got 60 seconds of fuel left. And I said, oh, wow. You know, because it didn't look like they were close to the ground at all.
Gotcha.
And then,
Gotcha, caller.
Yeah,
Mr. Logsdon.
Yeah, I mean, they got down. It was Charlie Duke, who later walked on the moon on Apollo 16. That was the capsule communicator, the Capcom, was calling out the time of the fuel left. He got down to 30 seconds. I was interacting with Charlie earlier this week, and he tells the story of by the time they got to 30 seconds and they were picking up some dust, whatever the rules were about calling it abort, he knew that Armstrong was going to land, because the commander had the final authority. He was there. He saw where they were vis-a-vis the lunar surface. So again, Armstrong was the man to be able to pilot that spacecraft to a landing, and it took a lot of nerves of steel to do it.
What was it particularly about where they landed on the moon? Why there?
Well, why there is basically because it was the easiest place to get to. I mean, Apollo 11 was fundamentally a demonstration of the ability to land on the moon and get back. They did a little science, but very little science. It was really a demonstration that we could meet Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon, returning him safely to Earth before this decade is out. So they were looking, and all the prior robotic and the two missions that had gone to the moon, Apollo 8 and Apollo 10, had looked for the best, easiest landing site and picked the Sea of Tranquility. Turned out that the specific spot that the guidance system picked was the wrong spot. But overall, it was a kind of flat place where you could land a spacecraft with minimum risk.
Here is from Alabama, Jimmy. You're on with our guest, John Logsdon. Hi.
Hi. I just want to relate to the experience I had to carry a caravan around the state of Alabama for about 30 years. They had red, white, and blue 18-wheelers pulling around the various cities, showing there were thousands of people come up to see it. They actually threw the rocks and the dust and the various equipment they used on that bicentennial caravan. It went to all the major cities in Alabama.
Okay, thanks, caller.
Yeah. I basically didn't hear much of that. Did you understand what he was?
Let's go to New York. Sally in Schenectady. Hi.
Thank you. I do have a question for Mr. Logsdon, but I wanted to say that I watched the landing from Bogota, Colombia. I was on vacation with my parents. We were in a big hotel, and there was one television in the television room. So we watched it communally, which is in itself a gift. And I heard a bit of Walter Cronkite. I heard a lot of La Luna, La Luna, La Luna. But the best part is the next day, as we walked around the streets of Bogota, people knew we were North Americans, and they would say, Felicidad, Felicidad, as if we had anything to do with it at all. My question for Mr. Logsdon, I would like you to comment, please, on the role that George Low played in initiating this project. Thank you.
Well, for your viewers, let's first say, who was George Low? He was a NASA career engineer, and even with the organization that preceded NASA. In 1960-61, he did the first study of the technical requirements for landing on the moon at NASA headquarters. So it was his study that allowed NASA to say to President Kennedy, yeah, give us enough money and we can do this. Then George, who I had the good fortune of knowing fairly well, moved to Houston with the establishment of the new Manned Spacecraft Center, and was the #2 person to the center director, Bob Gilruth, and kind of the day-by-day soul of the operation. Then after the Apollo 1 fire, he demoted himself to be the head of the Apollo spacecraft program, and he was the one that oversaw the redesign of the command and service module to get rid of all the problems that were the source of the fire that killed Grissom, Chaffee, and White. So he's kind of an unsung hero of Apollo, in my view. Point one. Point two, out of the blue 2 days ago, I got an email from his daughter, who is in the Washington area, saying, I'd love to get together and share memories of George Low and his role in Apollo. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So it's good that you know that, Sally. I mean, are you near RPI?
I think she's no longer on the line with us. But who are the other unsung heroes in your mind of this mission?
Oh, the man that came up with the idea of lunar orbit rendezvous, John Houbolt, a man that managed human spaceflight. Back then it was called manned spaceflight, but I'll say human. A man in Washington named George Miller, pronounced Miller but spelled Mueller, who was associate administrator for manned spaceflight. He was able to manage the program to success and keep the relationships with the contractors and with the Congress going. And then Jim Webb and Bob Siemens, the #1, #3 officials at NASA, were steady and kept the program on target.
This is John Logsdon, by the way, joining us. He's the founder of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University. He's the author of the book John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon. Atlanta, Georgia, this is Dottie. Hi.
Yes, hello. My name is Dottie Drummond Smith, and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. And my husband and I were very interested in the space program during the 60s. We actually were standing on the jetties at Cape Canaveral in February.
I'm sorry, Dottie, I didn't hear that.
Hold on, Dottie, for a second. She was talking about she was in Atlanta, Georgia, and watched it during the 60s. Dottie, try one more time, please.
Okay, yes. My husband and I were at Cape Canaveral, standing on the jetties, watching Win with Glenn, John Glenn, in February of 1962. And then my son was named Scott after Scott Carpenter. And then
who was the second Mercury astronaut in orbit.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Dottie.
That is correct. And then my husband and I, we were watching the moon landing and jumping up and down with much enthusiasm and excitement with the landing in 1969. So we actually grew up.
So
with
you
the
lived
program.
the program.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's Dottie in Atlanta, Georgia.
I have to say, I have a John Glenn story in here.
Please.
I was working in Manhattan in a totally different field, technical writing, in 1962, and on March the 1st, I went over to a couple streets over and watched John Glenn parade through Manhattan after his 1962 orbital flight. And that's what got me interested in space programs. So there was a direct line between John Glenn and my career, and I had the good fortune of being able to say that to that by then ex-Senator Glenn later in life. So, I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. Glenn is an Ohio person. Neil Armstrong is an Ohio person. those connections have been very gratifying.
How were the 3 astronauts received once they came back to Earth?
On August the 13th, they started the day in New York with a ticker tape parade, then flew Air Force 2 to Chicago for a ticker tape parade, then flew to Los Angeles for a banquet presided over by President Nixon. And then Nixon sent them on what was called the Giant Steps Tour around the world, 29 cities in 36 days or something like that. One of your callers said she was in Bogota, Colombia, which was the first stop on this Giant Steps Tour, and they got unanimous acclaim. The world said to them, "We did it. We, the world, landed on the moon." I mean, with the idea that this was an effort of all humanity, I think was very powerful and very successful.
This is Lisa, Louisville, Kentucky. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for C-SPAN. I appreciate this segment today. I remember in 1969, our whole neighborhood talked about nothing that day but the moon landing. We decided we had to get together and do something. I was only 11, and one of our neighbors took a little, couldn't remember if it was a Zenith or Motorola TV. We hooked it up on the outside of the porch, ran an extension cord through the window, and somebody had to hold the antenna ear so we could get a good reception. But our whole neighborhood was sitting there that night, 1969, watching the moon landing. And I have 4 heroes in my life during my lifetime: Muhammad Ali, JFK, Neil Armstrong, and John McCain. And 2 of them had to do with that great moon landing, and it seemed like after that, science boomed in schools. We did all kinds of aerospace projects. We did all kinds of moon talk. It was just a wonderful time, and I was so happy I could see it.
Lisa, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was great to be alive and be aware of what was happening. I mean, sending people to the moon was remarkable. It's been since December of '72 that anybody's been back. It's well past time, I think, for us to return.
I was going to ask you, what do you think is the sentiment now when it comes to space flight, manned space flight, human space flight, versus what you experienced back then at Apollo 11?
Well, it's good that you say not manned space flight, but human space flight. The current policy of the U.S. government is that the first person to go back to the moon will be a woman. President Trump, Vice President Pence have declared the intent to get back to the moon within the next 5 years, 2024. And there's a program. Its logo was, so it's official if it has a logo, was just unveiled yesterday, called Artemis. It's a stretch, it's a challenge, but so was Kennedy's. Everything has to go right. Congress has to be willing to fund it. American public, I think right now is, and particularly in the kind of excitement of this anniversary celebration, is interested in seeing the United States lead an international public-private coalition of companies and countries to get back to the moon as soon as possible.
Did that sentiment, as far as after the Apollo 11 mission, what was public sentiment like after that? Did it sustain? Did it wane? How would you gauge that?
Well, if you gauge it by the media, always a little risky. By Apollo 12 followed in November of '69. By Apollo 13, until it had its problems, television networks had stopped live coverage of the missions. So if that's an indication of their judgment of public interest, it waned rather quickly. It was, after all, repetitive. All you were doing is landing in a different spot. So it transitioned from being something that captivated the world to voyages of exploration that those that were close to it were interested in. By the time of Apollo 17 in December of '72, if anything could be described, anything related to flying to the moon could be described as routine, I think people began to accept, yeah, we can do this. And so the intense public interest really dissipated rather quickly.
In your mind, is Mars achievable as far as a human space flight? program is concerned?
Achievable. Achievable when is a different question. But I think that that most of the technologies we need to get humans to Mars are achievable. We really don't know how to protect the crew from radiation in a long voyage. We really should have a better propulsion system, something it has negative connotations, but it shouldn't, of a nuclear rocket engine that could cut the travel time down from 9 months to a couple of months. And if we develop the systems that would maximize the mission, I think it's achievable by mid-century, if not sooner.
Here is from Murphy, North Carolina, Jack. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. I had always heard that Armstrong was specifically selected because he was a civilian. And is there any truth to that?
That Armstrong was selected because he was a civilian, I think he said.
Yeah, I don't think that was, it was certainly a consideration that Neil, I mean, almost all the astronauts had been military test pilots. Neil was a test pilot, but he was a civilian test pilot. I don't think that was very high on the list of selection criteria for the mission. As I said earlier, it was, his crew was in the rotation that made them the choice for the first landing attempt. And then his bosses recognized that he was particularly well suited to be the first man, and the fact that he was civilian may well have been an element in that.
Let's try from Peoria, Illinois. We'll hear from Herb. Hi.
Hi, I was a 20-year-old mathematics and physics major in college, not knowing what I was going to do, so NASA was actually on my list. And I ended up being a college teacher. I've been a college professor for over 40 years, teaching the history of mathematics in particular. And when I think about watching the Apollo landing, 66 years is a blink of the eye in the history of the world. And it was only 66 years after the Wright brothers. And I remember that hitting me, that, my God, my dad was just born 2 years after the Wright brothers, and he was sitting there watching them land on the moon. And that's a perspective I think a lot of people lose.
Right. A couple of things to say about that. One is, at ceremony the night before the launch of Apollo 11, Lindbergh was there. Not very public. He didn't like being out in public. A man named Hermann Oberth, who was von Braun's mentor back in Germany and one of the three recognized 20th century rocket pioneers, was there. There was a compression of history that indeed we stepped on the moon within 66 years of the Wright brothers' first flight. So, American historian pardon me, Arthur Schlesinger said, when the history of the 20th century is recorded hundreds of years from now, the one thing that will be remembered is Apollo and Apollo 11. We'll see whether that's, well, I won't see, but I think that may be the case.
Is it true that Armstrong took a piece of the Wright Flyer up with him?
He did indeed. It belongs to this museum. It's upstairs here today. And he did take, I mean, Neil's dedication was to the practice of flight, whether it's airplanes, rocket planes, or spacecraft. And so the museum loaned him some pieces of the Wright Flyer to take to the moon with him to kind of demonstrate that historical continuity.
A conversation with John Logsdon. He's the author of the book John F. Kennedy and the Race to the Moon, the founder of George Washington University's Space Policy Institute. Thank you for your time today.
It's been a pleasure.
We are live from the National